Greetings. I would like to welcome you to this week's African History lesson, a lesson in African history, presented by the Office of African, African American, Latino, Holocaust, and Gender Studies. Each week, we bring you a different topic or an array of topics each week pertaining to the history of Africa and its people. So this week, we're going to focus on one particular topic: African resistance, nationalism, and independence. Our objective of today's lesson: the students will understand and be able to discuss the attitudes and sentiments of African people towards decolonization. Students will understand and be able to discuss the historical significance of Kwame Nkrumah. Students will understand and be able to discuss the historical significance of Amilcar Cabral. Students will understand and be able to discuss the historical significance of Patrice Lumumba and also Nelson Mandela. So as we speak about decolonization, we have to go back and understand where did colonization begin. So the colonization of the African continent started during the Berlin Conference. It actually started before this. But the Berlin Conference was a huge historical event which led to the complete colonization, or almost complete colonization of the African continent. What the Berlin Conference did in 1884 to 1885 regulated European colonization and trade on the African continent. It led to the colonization of the African continent by these European powers: Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, and Italy. By the end of this and going into the early 20th century, all held colonies in Africa. So what happened during the Berlin Conference is that it formalized the colonization or scramble for Africa. Diplomats from these different countries met in Berlin and laid the rules of competition and set guidelines for seeking colonies on the continent. By 1914, it was only two African nations, which were Liberia and Ethiopia, which were remained independent or were not colonized. So when we speak about decolonization, Haile Selassie I, who was an emperor of Ethiopia, had a powerful speech as he accepted his presidency on May 25th, 1963, at the Organization of African Unity in the capital city of Addis Ababa. He was the first president of the OAU, or the Organization for African Unity. And he said here, the events of the past 150 years require no extended resuscitation from us. The period of colonialism into which we plunged culminated with our continent feathered and bound, with our once proud and free people reduced to humiliation and slavery, which Africa's terrain crosshatched and checkerboarded by artificial and arbitrary boundaries. Many of us during these bitter years were overwhelmed in battles, and those who escaped conquest did so at the cost of desperate resistance and bloodshed. Others were sold into bondage as the price extracted from the colonists for protection which they extended and the possession of which they disposed. Africa was a physical resource to be exploited, and Africans were chattels to be purchased bodily, or at best, people to be reduced to vassalage and latchkeyhood. Africa was the market for the produce of other nations and a source of raw materials, which their factories were fed. And it was later said that by Kwame Nkrumah that African people were poor, but the African continent was not poor. And this was a direct result of colonization. So first we talk about Kwame Nkrumah. He was the first prime minister from 1957 to 1960 and president from 1960 to 1966 of the Republic of Ghana. Ghana was the first sub-Saharan African nation to gain its independence. He was a Pan-Africanist, which is a worldwide movement that aims to encourage and strengthen bonds of unity and solidarity between continental Africans and other people of African descent throughout their diaspora. In 1963, he and other African leaders formed something known as the OAU, or the Organization of African Unity. Their purpose was to remain neutral in political affairs outside of the African continent, and they worked in an alliance of independent African nations to enhance cooperation of the newly decolonized African governments, which came in the 1960s, in a promotion of solidarity among African states, and also working to improve the quality of life for Africans. Our next person is Amilcar Cabral. Cabral was a leader in the struggle for independence in a country known as Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. Cabral believed that independence would only be possible through military engagement or physical violence. In 1956, he helped found the African Party for the Independence of Cape Verde and Guinea. By 1966, through military efforts, this organization claimed over 60% of political control of Guinea-Bissau. Unfortunately, he was assassinated in 1973. In a subsequent year, in 1974, Guinea-Bissau gained its independence from the Portuguese. The next individual that we're going to discuss is Patrice Lumumba. He was the first prime minister of an independent nation known as the Republic of Congo. He helped found the movement National Congolese. He advocated the complete dismantling of Belgian rule in the Congo. Matter of fact, in 1959, he was arrested for allegedly inciting an anti-colonial riot, where he was sentenced for 6 months in prison. When he was invited to Brussels in 1960, which is the capital of Belgium, Lumumba condemned Belgian rule and advocated immediate independence of the Congo. In his famous speech given on June 30th, 1960, he stated, "We are proud of this struggle of tears, of fire, and of blood, to the depths of our being, for it was a noble and just struggle, and indispensable to put an end to the humiliating slavery which was imposed upon us by force by the Belgian government. The Republic of Congo has been proclaimed in our country and now in the hands of its own children. Together, my brothers and sisters, we're going to begin a new struggle, a sublime struggle, which will lead our country to peace, prosperity, and greatness." Unfortunately, he was apprehended by his opposition, and he was assassinated by rebels in 1961. But before that, 1960, Congo gained their independence, and he was the first prime minister. Our most famous of these leaders is Nelson Mandela. He was the first president of a post-apartheid South Africa. In 1940, he joined the African National Congress, popularly known as the ANC. The purpose of the ANC was aimed at improving the status of non-whites in South Africa, who their career trajectory and their lives was stifled by racial discrimination, similar to what was going on here in the United States under Jim Crow segregation. He was dissatisfied with their moderate approach or their nonviolent approach. So he helped launch the ANC's Youth League, dedicated to radical programs of boycotts and civil disobedience against South Africa. After the Sharpeville massacre of 1960, which occurred actually on March 21st, 1960, in a township in South Africa known as Sharpeville, the residents were boycotting apartheid laws, which resulted in the deaths of a large number of South Africans. After this riot, not riot, but after this conflict, the ANC was banned in South Africa. Eventually, Mandela helped create a military wing, which their official stance was violence. And in 1961, at the All African Conference, Mandela denounced apartheid and advocated a new democratic constitution. He eventually left the country in exile, but he was arrested and charged with an illegal exit and also inciting strikes in the country. He was tried and convicted to 5 years in prison. While in prison, government officials charged Mandela and the entire ANC leadership with treason and conspiracy, and he was found guilty in 1964 and sentenced to life in prison. In 1990, South Africa lifted the ban on the ANC and released Mandela. And in 1994, under the leadership of Mandela, the ANC won elections and Nelson Mandela became the first president of a post-apartheid South Africa. So I'm going to leave you with this quote by Haile Selassie, and it's also made famous by Bob Marley in one of his songs called War. Until the philosophy which holds one race superior and another inferior is finally and permanently discredited and abandoned, everywhere is war. Until there are no longer first class and second class citizens of any nation, until the color of a man's skin is no more significant than the color of his eyes, there will always be war. So I thank you for joining us for this week's lesson in African history as we talked about decolonization of Africa, resistance, and independence. We look forward to you joining us for next week's lesson.